Slavery in America did not end with a single law or one famous speech. It ended through blood, resistance, and a war that nearly tore the nation apart. Millions were enslaved, yet freedom came unevenly, contested at every step, and delayed for generations. The story of how the United States ended slavery is not simple or comfortable, but it is essential to understand. Slavery arrived in what would become the United States long before the nation itself existed. In 1619, enslaved Africans were brought to the English colony of Virginia, marking the beginning of a system that would become deeply embedded in American society. Over the next 2 centuries, slavery expanded alongside colonial growth, shaping the economy, culture, and political structure of the colonies and later the young republic. When the United States declared independence in 1776, its founding ideals spoke of liberty, equality, and natural rights. Yet these words existed in direct contradiction to the reality that nearly 1/5 of the population was enslaved. The Declaration of Independence did not abolish slavery. In fact, the new nation was built with compromises that allowed slavery to survive. The Constitution protected slavery indirectly through clauses that counted enslaved people for representation while denying them rights, and by allowing the transatlantic slave trade to continue until 1808. In the early decades of the Republic, slavery became more deeply entrenched in the southern states. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 transformed slavery from a declining institution into an economic powerhouse. Cotton production exploded, and with it, the demand for enslaved labor. Slavery spread westward into new territories, raising an urgent and explosive question: would these new states be free or slave? At the same time, resistance to slavery never stopped. Enslaved people resisted through rebellion, escape, work slowdowns, and the preservation of culture and identity. Some revolts, like those led by Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner, terrified slaveholding society and led to harsher laws. Thousands more escaped through networks later known as the Underground Railroad, aided by free black communities and white abolitionists who risked their lives to help. By the early 19th century, abolitionism had grown into a powerful moral and political movement. Abolitionists used newspapers, speeches, books, and petitions to expose the brutality of slavery. Formerly enslaved people like Frederick Douglass told their stories, forcing Americans to confront the human cost of the system. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin reached millions, shaping public opinion in the North and enraging slaveholders in the South. Despite growing opposition, slavery was protected by law and violence. Supreme Court decisions like the Dred Scott ruling of 1857 declared that black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. This decision shocked the North and convinced many that slavery could not be ended through compromise alone. As the nation expanded westward, political tensions intensified. Compromises attempted to maintain balance between free and slave states, but each one merely postponed conflict. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act all revealed how deeply divided the nation had become. Violence in Bleeding Kansas showed that the struggle over slavery was already becoming a war in miniature. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 marked a turning point. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery but did not initially call for its immediate abolition where it already existed. Even so, Southern leaders viewed his election as an existential threat. One by one, Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. Slavery was not a secondary issue, it was central to their decision to leave. When the Civil War began in 1861, the United States did not immediately fight to end slavery. The primary goal of the Union was to preserve the nation. But as the war dragged on, it became clear that slavery was both the moral core of the conflict and the economic engine of the Confederacy. Enslaved people themselves forced the issue by fleeing to Union lines in massive numbers, refusing to support the system that oppressed them. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document did not end slavery everywhere. It declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free, while slavery remained legal in border states loyal to the Union. Still, the proclamation fundamentally transformed the war. It made the destruction of slavery a central goal of the Union cause and allowed black men to serve in the U.S. Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors fought for the Union, many of them formerly enslaved. Their service was decisive. They fought not only for the survival of the nation, but for their own freedom and dignity. Their participation challenged racist assumptions and made it impossible to deny that African Americans had earned citizenship through sacrifice. As the war neared its end, Lincoln and his allies recognized that slavery could not truly be abolished without a constitutional amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime measure and could be reversed. In 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States. Later that year, the amendment was ratified by the states, legally ending slavery for more than 4 million people. But the end of slavery on paper did not mean the end of oppression. The period known as Reconstruction attempted to redefine American democracy. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, while the 15th Amendment aimed to protect black male voting rights. For a brief moment, the nation moved toward a more inclusive vision of freedom. That moment was violently resisted. White supremacist groups used terror to undermine black political participation. Southern states passed black codes to control labor and restrict freedom. When federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, Reconstruction collapsed. Slavery was gone, but a new system of racial oppression, segregation, disenfranchisement, and forced labor through convict leasing took its place. Understanding how the USA ended slavery requires acknowledging both progress and failure. Slavery was not ended by goodwill alone. It was destroyed through resistance by enslaved people, moral pressure from abolitionists, political struggle, and a devastating civil war that cost over 600,000 lives. Freedom was won, but equality was delayed. The end of slavery reshaped the United States forever. It redefined the meaning of citizenship, expanded the promise of the Constitution, and forced the nation to confront its deepest contradictions. Yet the legacy of slavery did not disappear. Its economic, social, and racial consequences continue to shape American life. The story of how the United States ended slavery is not a story of a single hero or moment. It is a long, painful struggle involving millions of voices, many of whom were silenced for generations. It reminds us that freedom is not simply granted by laws, but secured through courage, sacrifice, and continued vigilance. Slavery ended in the United States not because it faded away, but because it was challenged at every level, by those who endured it, by those who opposed it, and by a nation forced to confront what it truly stood for. The meaning of slavery's end continued to evolve long after the 13th Amendment was ratified. For formerly enslaved people, freedom was not a single moment, but a fragile condition that had to be defended daily. Families searched for loved ones sold away decades earlier. Communities built schools, churches, and mutual aid networks from nothing, laying the foundations of black civic life in America. Education became a powerful symbol of freedom, even as it was met with violence and intimidation. At the national level, the struggle over slavery's legacy reshaped politics and law. Debates over states' rights, federal authority, and racial equality dominated the late 19th century. Supreme Court decisions gradually weakened the protections promised by Reconstruction, allowing segregation and discrimination to become entrenched. By the early 20th century, Jim Crow laws ruled much of the South, enforcing racial separation and inequality for decades. Yet the end of slavery also planted seeds that could not be erased. The amendments passed after the Civil War became constitutional tools future generations would use to challenge injustice. Activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens repeatedly returned to these promises, demanding that the nation live up to them. The civil rights movement of the 20th century drew directly from the unfinished work of emancipation, framing segregation and disenfranchisement as extensions of slavery by other means. Globally, America's abolition of slavery influenced debates about human rights and freedom, even as the nation struggled to uphold those ideals at home. The contradiction between declared values and lived reality remained a defining tension in U.S. history. Ending slavery was not the conclusion of that struggle, but a turning point that forced the nation onto a new and difficult path. To understand how the USA ended slavery is to understand that history does not move in straight lines. Progress was achieved, reversed, and fought for again. Freedom expanded, but never automatically. It required constant pressure from below and difficult decisions at the highest levels of power. The abolition of slavery stands as one of the most consequential transformations in American history. It destroyed an institution that had shaped the nation for over 2 centuries and opened the door, however imperfectly, to a broader definition of freedom. The story does not offer simple closure, but it does offer clarity. Slavery ended because it was challenged relentlessly, and its legacy continues to demand attention. This history reminds us that the end of slavery was not only about the past. It remains a lens through which Americans continue to examine justice, equality, and the meaning of freedom itself. In the final measure, the end of slavery in the United States was both a triumph and an unfinished promise. It marked the legal destruction of a system that denied humanity to millions, yet it also exposed how deeply inequality had been woven into the nation's foundations. Emancipation closed one chapter of American history, but it opened another, one defined by the long struggle to turn freedom into lived reality. The abolition of slavery forced the United States to redefine itself. The nation could no longer claim liberty as an abstract ideal while denying it in practice. Through constitutional change, sacrifice, and resistance, the meaning of American citizenship expanded beyond what the founders had imagined. That transformation came at extraordinary cost, but it reshaped the moral direction of the country. The legacy of slavery's end still echoes today. Debates over civil rights, economic inequality, and racial justice are rooted in the consequences of a system that once structured American life. Understanding how slavery ended helps explain why those debates persist, and why the work of building a more equal society remains ongoing. The story of how the USA ended slavery is not simply about laws passed or battles won. It is about people who refused to accept bondage, communities that demanded dignity, and a nation forced to confront its deepest contradictions. It reminds us that freedom is not a fixed achievement, but a responsibility passed from one generation to the next. Slavery ended in the United States because it was resisted, challenged, and ultimately dismantled through immense struggle. The question that remains is not how slavery ended, but how fully the promise of that ending has been honored.